Chief Chapman is a retired Major General of the British Army. He was also an advisor to the US Central Command. Welcome to the program, Major General Chapman.
It's a pleasure to be here, Daniel.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Ukraine intends to hold this captured ground in the Kursk region for a certain period of time. He said that Ukraine intends to indefinitely hold this ground. From your perspective, do you feel that Ukraine is turning tide of this war right now?
Well, firstly, I don't think you'll hold all the ground, and it would be probably foolish to do that, because ground by itself has no meaning unless it's ultimately defensible. So you need to look at what is the vital ground in Kursk, what is the key terrain, and shape the battlefield according to that. And that is why I think you see some of the bridges being destroyed in the Kursk regions to shape that battlefield to enable Ukraine to hold as much as it wants, because I think it will seize and maintain most of its position, but it won't seize and hold all the terrain there. That would be potentially, from a military perspective, foolish. And if things get too hot with too many forces arraigned against Ukraine, ultimately, then I think Ukrainian generalship generally has been clever enough to know when to withdraw, as it did, for example, in the ultimate withdrawal from Bakhmut, when the objective of the Ukrainians had been established to attrit the Russian forces to a significant level.
Do you see the Kursk region as a key terrain of this war?
Well, it's potentially key psychological terrain, because all wars end, and they don't necessarily, or they can end by decisive military victory. We're not seeing that from either side at the moment. They can end by the improbability of military victory, and Kursk can play into that. And also it plays into this notion that there would be no frozen conflict. And that's important, that I think Ukraine has territory where Putin can't just freeze the conflict as one of his potential options if there were to be negotiations. And this notion that Ukraine has to live with the territorial realities of the illegal annexation of the four administrative areas of, Zaporizhia, Kherson, the Donetsk and Luhansk.
Also, from your perspective, how do you see the main achievements of this offensive operation of Ukraine in the Kursk region? President Zelensky said that this operation has already diverted troops, 60,000 Russian troops from the battlefields in Ukraine to the Kursk region.
Yeah, I think the diversion of troops is a good thing. That relieves pressure, particularly in the Sunni region. I think there's been a lot of bad analysis that suggested that Russia would take troops from its main effort in the Donetsk, particularly at the moment towards the Pokrovsk region. It was never going to do that. And I say that from the basis of battlefield geometry. If you look at where Kursk is in relation to Belgorod, Luhansk and Donetsk, the transfer of troops in terms of time and space was never going to happen. And from that region of the Donetsk, particularly when Russia explicitly stated that their operational objective is in Pokrovsk. So that wasn't going to happen in that sector. So it does relieve some of the burden on Ukraine in other regions, but it doesn't relieve the burden in Donetsk.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian army has successfully encircled 2,000 or 3,000 Russian troops near the river of Seym. From your perspective, how could it influence the outcome of this battle of Kursk, and would Russia be able to redeploy that troops from this area to other areas of the front line?
Well, again, this plays into the psychological ripples. It does add to your sort of exchange of prisoners of war. And one of the things that we always say in terms of cutting forces, the ground lines of communication, is that the nearer the force, nearer to the force that a cut is made, the more immediate the effect. And conversely, the nearer to the base that a cut is made, the greater the effect. So this really is a kettles the Russian forces on this side of the river. That's significant. And when you've got nowhere to go with your backs to the wall, with the continuous Ukraine attrition of the pontoon bridges, that does lead to this psychological collapse, because there are always two parts to war. There's a physical part, which you can count numbers and things, but there's also this psychological part, which is often difficult to understand. And it's the collapse of will and morale of the troops in that area, which is probably likely to happen. Very, very few armies fight to the last man, and we're certainly not seeing that from the Russian forces.
You mentioned about the psychological aspect of this war. Ukrainian troops have captured Russian land, invaded Russia for the first time since the Second World War. How could it influence the morale of those Russian troops who are fighting this war on other areas in Ukraine, for example? What do they feel when they fight this war, but their own land is occupied by Ukraine?
Well, I think it's wider than that. So if you go for the initial notion that this was supposed to be a 3-day special military operation, and we're now heading towards 950 days, and Ukraine has the capability and fortitude to go and do an offensive operation into Russian territory, that does send both these psychological ripples to the military, but it sends the ripples to the elites in Moscow, and it sends ripples to the population. Now, at the end of August, the most current polling in Russia showed a 10% increase of those with an unfavorable view of Russian actions in the last month, up 10% from July to August. Now, if that could be compounded in a linear fashion, then there would be a collapse. Now, I'm not suggesting that that will happen, because very, very often things don't happen in a linear fashion. But if that could be built on psychologically, that would be impacted. The caveat on that is the last time that the polling was as bad as this, from a Russian perspective, was during the time of the mobilization in the autumn of 2022. Exactly the same figure of 28% had a negative view of the Russian parliament and Putin. It was never built on, so you can recover from that. What we do know about authoritarian states is that they do seem to be stable right up to the point that they may collapse. The one that I would look at in the longer term is, the mothers sort of movement. Now, that has been fairly benign at the moment in Russia, but there could be a growing part of that in the future of our children are not there to be fertilizer. That's one to look for, but Putin at the moment has done divide and rule on that, and that's not come to the fore in the way that one might have thought. So one has to be careful in overemphasizing these things, but it's either the military collapse, a political polity collapse, or the population rejecting what has been going on, which are the most significant things. When you do not look like from either side will be a decisive military victory, and it's all that, of course, which ultimately sets the scene for negotiations at some time, although I don't think that we're anywhere near negotiations at the moment, but it does play the cards better for Ukraine in terms of this not freezing the conflict because you're occupying some Russian territory. I don't think it's a trading between one and the other in terms of you hold, 1,000 square kilometers, you give back 1,000 square kilometers, because that would be against the international norms, and Ukraine should obviously return to its 1991 boundaries. That would be the just peace which everyone should really seek from the Western perspective.
You mentioned about this topic of negotiations. President Zelensky said that this operation in the Kursk region aimed also to force Vladimir Putin, to force Russia to negotiate with Ukraine an end of this war. What are the chances for that from your personal from your personal opinion?
Well, we always look at probability yardsticks. Is something low, medium, high in terms of those yardsticks? And, it's always difficult to put a time on these things. But I would say at the moment, the probability of that negotiation is still low. And I still think that the objectives of Russia are still pretty imperialistic. That needs to be changed. The notch by being in Kursk helps that, but I don't think we're anywhere near a point where negotiations are feasible or tenable from either side's perspective. Each has too much to lose, and the position of Putin would be probably undermined. He's still got this imperial mindset. He still thinks that he can win. His victory is still outlasting Ukraine by an implosion of Western support. I think Kursk also plays into that from Ukraine's perspective, in that it gave a fillip to the West in terms of Ukraine seizing the initiative and showing momentum. And those are really important things, again, psychologically for the supporters in the West.
You mentioned about the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, and I would like to cover the support for Putin by his elites and his inner circle. How does this offensive inside Russia influence the support among Putin elites and from his inner circle, from his security services, their support for the Putin's regime?
Well, it's a good question, but it's a really difficult question to answer, because one can take the view that everyone has equal culpability in Russia in terms of the invasion of Ukraine, and that those in the circle of elites around him are as likely to find themselves in the International Criminal Court as Ukraine is if Russia loses. So is Putin weakened? The no answer would be because the entire political and military apparatus is complicit. If you were to reverse that and say, yes, Putin is weakened by the Kursk offensive, that would be because there doesn't seem to have been any great swelling of patriotism from the incursion into Kursk. And he doesn't seem to have lost his image as Russia's protector. So it's difficult to be totally objective about that without really just using a gut feeling. And one of the things about being an analyst is you should be very, very careful of confirmation bias, and therefore, it's not inevitable that Putin is weakened by these things.
It's interesting also to discuss this issue with Russian conscripts. Young Russian conscripts were deployed to the Kursk war zone, to the Kursk battlefield for the first time from the beginning of the full-scale invasion. According to the New York Times, some conscripts, some units consisted of conscripts were deployed to the Kursk region. From your perspective, would it be a big mistake for Vladimir Putin to deploy conscripts, to deploy them largely to the Kursk area and to order them to liberate the Kursk region?
Well, the first thing is a legal point, that although conscripts can't be used in a war outside of Russia, and this is still from a Putin perspective a special military operation, they've been very careful not to classify the incursion into Kursk as a war. Because Kursk is part of Russian territory, then conscripts can be used there. Now, the risk of using conscripts in the Kursk region is really twofold. The first one is their combat capability. That is, they have very, very limited training. And the second one plays into this psychological part, that if they take very heavy casualties, and generally untrained conscripts tend to do that, then that does play into this part of the population and the mothers rising up in revolt in the same way that they did in the Afghanistan campaign. And it was partly that which put the scale on what Russia could do, and ultimately leading to Russians' withdrawal. So although they might need to use the conscripts because of their manpower deficiencies elsewhere, there is a risk in doing that. And I think that plays into Ukraine's favor.
Do you feel that there are only bad options for Vladimir Putin right now?
Not every option is bad for Putin. The one risk at the moment, I think, for Ukraine is the offensive by the Russians into the Pokrovsk region. I think they've been, to use the Russian a Russian proverb, the chicken pecks grain by grain. The chicken is pecking slightly faster and more aggressively and is a bigger chicken in that direction. The sort of pacing item, which we generally talk about in war, that is that which is in greatest lack of supply, which caveats things in that region, in the Donetsk, seems to be forces and resources, both manpower and artillery. It does worry me slightly in that sector, because Russia, if they were to take that, and I'm not suggesting there's an absolute collapse on that sector at the moment, and that Russia will prevail there, but that would potentially be disastrous in terms of that grand line of communication for Ukraine in that sector, because of its significance as a key rail and road hub for the supply of other parts of Ukrainian forces in that sector. So, that must be held. That would be the key thing. A lot of people 6 months ago were talking about the fall of Avdiivka as being operationally significant. It wasn't, but it was Avdiivka which leading the way to Pokrovsk, which is significant. So the fall of Pokrovsk would be operationally significant in the way that I assess that the fall of Avdiivka 6 months ago was not.
Also, Reuters reported that the White House was moving forward to green light and to agree to send to Ukraine long-range cruise missiles GASMM, which could be used with US-made F-16 jets. From your perspective, could it really turn the tide in this war? And there are also two variants of these missiles with 300 kilometers range and with 800 kilometers range. What type of missile would be more useful for the Ukrainian army right now?
Well, of course it would. It's really the JASM, the Joint Air-Surface Standoff Missile that we're talking about, and there are two variants. I suspect that the 230-mile range variant, the 370-kilometer one, would be the one that Ukraine receives more of, purely because the inventory for that is bigger. Now, like all these things, we have to look at the timeliness of this. Firstly, there's likely to be a decision in the fall, and then delivery is likely to take place a few months later. So none of this is going to influence at the moment the outcome of either what is going on in Kursk or what is going on in the Donetsk. Now, of course, from a Ukrainian perspective, it would be better if you received the longer range mission, because the ability to strike deep, which Ukraine is doing very, very successfully at the moment, in terms of pushing staging areas and supply depots back, is enabled by the range of missiles that you are given. Having said that, Ukraine is doing very well with its indigenously produced missiles and indigenously produced drones, and I think we saw that in the attacks near to Moscow in the last week on the 1st of September, and the fact that you are now modifying a attack drone with a significant range to complement the Neptune, and having already really destroyed the Russian fleet in the Black Sea by the use of ATACMS, Neptune, and other indigenously produced drones and cruise missiles. Ukraine can do that successfully with its own missiles, and it'd be great if that would be supplemented by the American JASMs, and to have release authority of the ATACMS to strike in Russia, because Ukraine is successfully prosecuting the deep battle very well. The greatest example of that really in the last week or so is the fact that the oil depot of Prolatarsk in the Rostov region, of the 76 oil tanks there, only 8 survived after the drone strike by Ukraine, and that's probably led to a $500 million downfall in terms of the revenues that would have been produced from that oil. So making sure that Ukraine continues with the deep battle successfully, which I think it is, protecting Ukraine's assets, because Russia is reciprocatingly fighting its own deep battle at the same time, and making sure that you have the assets, forces and resources for the close battle. All those need to be synchronized in time and space to be successful.
Let's cover also today's Russia's missile attack on Ukraine, also on our city, on Lviv. 7 people and 3 of them children were killed today in the morning by Russian missiles during the numerous waves of Russia's missile attack on our city. Russia has destroyed civilian infrastructure in Lviv using several hypersonic missiles, Kinjal. What is your assessment of these illegal strikes on civilian infrastructure?
Well, of course, targeting should be legitimate and proportionate, and any attacks on civilians are not. It just once again shows that there are elements of either targeting which goes wrong, or deliberate targeting, which shows the nature of the Russian regime. The Russians will continue to do this. We would probably say that the Kinjal is not a hypersonic missile. There's a bit of spin on that. That doesn't matter when you're on the other end of that. From the perspective of looking at it, the Russians would look at it from a measurement of effectiveness assessment. How are their missiles getting through? What are their best attack routes? And therefore, if we flip that coin, we need to ask, what air defense assets do Ukraine need to supplement what they've got? And how best can they be procured and deployed to stop the routing and the balance of those missiles which the Russians are firing? Now, the success rate of Ukraine against drones is very, very successful. And the attacks on the Russian attacks, the biggest attack on the 26th of August, the biggest attack for a couple of years, quite a lot of both drones, cruise missiles and ballistic missiles were knocked down by the Ukrainian air defense. But the West can always supplement that with even more. And I think, for example, in the last couple of days, we've heard that the Germans are going to provide 2 more Iris-T to air defense systems to Ukraine. And we must keep that going, both in terms of the hardware and the number of missiles that Ukraine has, along with, of course, the artillery and aircraft. So you've got 3 A's, which Ukraine absolutely needs at the moment: artillery, ammunition particularly, aircraft, the F-16s, more of them coming, so you can clout, not dribble, and air defense. Those are the 3 big ones that you need immediately and sustainably.
Would it be enough for the West just to provide Ukraine with additional anti-aircraft systems, but not to allow Ukraine to strike deep and to destroy the systems, launcher zones, and also airfields which are used by Russia to attack Ukraine with missile and drone attacks?
Well, Daniel, I'm a military man. Of course, my answer to that is, of course you should. So can we, the systems are there to attack the Russian launch pads and airfields. Should we and must we are political questions. There's always been this fear of escalation from the Russians. I think that we've seen, because of the incursion in Kursk, that a lot of that is kind of overplayed from the perspective of the West. And I think the best thing I've heard about that recently is Lord Robertson, obviously a former UK Defence Minister and also NATO Secretary General, and who said recently that Putin is only forced to retreat from Ukraine by an absence of Western caution, and we need that absence of Western caution. Otherwise, it's self-defeating fears of escalation, and that's what they are. They are self-defeating, these fears of escalation. Every red line has been crossed. Nothing has really happened from a Russian perspective. There's always that fear of the nuclear escalation. That is also overplayed, and has shown that the utility of nuclear weapons is really not there, because you'd have thought one of the potential options after an incursion would have been some rhetoric, probably from Medvedev or something like that, which has not occurred. So we need to, from a Western perspective, certainly from a military perspective, but really politicians who make these decisions, we need to remove this caution to allow Ukraine to prevail by enabling its deep strike.
Also, Russian officials said that Moscow would adjust its nuclear protocols due to the current threats from the West. Do you see this as another Russia's attempt to undermine Western support for Ukraine and just to play on this on this Western fear of escalation?
Yeah, I think it plays just on this Western fear of escalation. It's more rhetoric. I've said a number of times on these sorts of interviews that you can escalate in 8 ways. You can escalate by weapons, objectives, targets, geography, domains, rhetoric, scale, or mobilization. Nuclear would be both by weapons and scale, but I just don't see it happening at the moment. And of course, what we look for is what we call I and W, indicators and warnings, and there are no indicators and warnings at the moment that Russia is getting to a posture where it would even contemplate doing that. Now, we always have to look at that to see if the situation changes, but there is no indication of that being used at the moment.
Thank you, Major General Chapman, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to Ukraine. Thank you for having me, Daniel.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.